welcome to the second part of our bumper double special edition of Revolutionary Despatches. Double spooky special, it is Halloween. I'm Katherine, Wright.
And I'm David Barrett.
And we're back after what has been not too long for us, but may have been a while for you. Who knows? Maybe you came back to this episode an hour or two later, a day or two later. It may well be that you choose not to listen till after the election, so that the anticipation doesn't kill you.
Yeah.
So
if it is after the election, then oh dear, that was bad, wasn't it? Or possibly, alternatively, oh dear, that was also bad.
Yeah, but slightly less so.
Possibly less so.
Yeah. So really, there's one big topic when it comes to American politics right now, but there is a second one: the confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett
as a chaser.
So for those of you who don't know, a little while ago, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, long-serving Supreme Court justice, died of cancer. Now, the way Supreme Court positions work in the US is that they are for life unless you resign early. Ruth Bader Ginsburg didn't. In fact, she was working from hospital right up until pretty much the moment of her death. Now, the last time Supreme Court justice died, it was Justice Antonin Scalia, and he died back during the Obama administration. But the Republican Party under Mitch McConnell basically decided that they weren't going to allow Obama as nominee, Merrick Garland, to be confirmed. This time, with Ginsburg's death, even though she died much closer to the election, Scalia died back in sort of January time, they've decided to forge ahead.
It's worth saying also that the Senate Republicans said that if a Democrat were to win the presidency, they would continue the entire 4-year term.
Oh, well, yeah, we'll get to that, but yeah. So, despite the fact that Ginsburg died much closer to the election than Scalia had, and therefore, arguably, the Republicans' argument from before, which at the time was completely spurious, would have had some validity, they, shockingly to everyone concerned, completely reversed course and decided that they had to confirm a new nominee to the Supreme Court post-haste. Quickly, damn it. Haven't you seen the polls? Joe Biden's going to win.
Yeah.
We need to get a right-winger on there before tea time. And despite the fact that it had never been done before, the record for confirming a Supreme Court justice to court was actually slightly longer in terms of number of days than the amount of time remaining before the election. So it had never been done this quickly before, but the other day, the Republicans succeeded in confirming Amy Coney Barrett to be the newest justice.
It's quite something.
Yeah, it's bad, is what it is. It's really bad. Because where Ruth Bader Ginsburg was the second most liberal justice on the court, behind only Justice Sotomayor, Amy Coney Barrett, according to analysis of her appeals court record, is probably the third most conservative, behind Thomas and Alito. Now, obviously, she hasn't been on the Supreme Court before, so that is subject to change somewhat, depending on how she fits into the new court. But based on her previous judgments as an appeals court judge, that's roughly where she fits in. So this swings the balance of the court significantly.
Yes.
This isn't a small change, you know. This is big stuff.
And the Supreme Court in the American context has a lot of power. It's not actually in the Constitution that it has this power, but what it's ended up with, which is basically that according to the interpretation of the Constitution of the people who are on that court, they can then strike down pretty much any law passed by Congress.
It's worth saying that this isn't quite the same thing as judicial review in the UK. We have a similar thing here, but in the UK context, the Supreme Court can only say that something is incompatible with the Human Rights Act, for example, and refer it back to Parliament. They can't actually strike the law down in the same way that they can in the States.
Britain, we have no distinction.
No, not as such, no. Certainly not. We have a few pieces of legislation that sort of function as constitutional,
right, yeah.
one, but yeah, quite right. It doesn't have any more... It doesn't have any stronger foundation than the rest of the law. It can be repealed by a simple majority in the House of Commons just as easily as any other act.
Yeah.
So yeah, Coney Barrett's confirmation is really big news because... So previously, the situation on the court was that... So at the beginning of Donald Trump's term, of course, you had a vacancy where Scalia was, and he was pretty conservative. And then you had a few conservatives, a few liberal justices, and then in the middle you had a guy called Anthony Kennedy, When Neil Gorsuch was eventually confirmed to take the position that was vacated by Scalia, that made Kennedy the midpoint of the court. And he was a Republican nominally, but very moderate compared to sort of modern Republicans. And he reasonably often, although this can be a little exaggerated, I think, but he reasonably often would side with them. Then when Kennedy died, he was replaced by Kavanaugh, Brett Kavanaugh. I'm sure we all remember that particular nightmare of a confirmation process. Kavanaugh, significantly to the right of Kennedy, and so that pulled the court balance right, so that now the swing justice is a guy called John Roberts, who is actually the Supreme Justice? The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So he's the boss, basically. And he became the swing justice. He was to the right of Kennedy, but he was also the Chief Justice, so he had some other constraints working on him. Basically, he didn't want to look like he was being too partisan, because that might make him look bad, and it might make the court as a whole look bad, and he was quite concerned. He's quite concerned. He's still alive. I'm talking about him as if he's dead. He's quite concerned with the reputation of the court going sort of into the long term, as a Chief Justice might be. Any judgment that is made by the court while Roberts is Chief Justice will go down as a Roberts Court judgment. So his name's going to be on the thing. With the death of Ginsburg and the confirmation of Coney Barrett, Brett Kavanaugh is now the... Now, I don't know if you remember Brett Kavanaugh more than simply the fact that he was confirmed rather to the Supreme Court despite being accused of rape by a former classmate. But in case you don't remember anything other than that, and I wouldn't blame you, he's pretty conservative. Yeah. he's one of these sort of Brett Kavanaugh is one of these sort of Federalist Society types. The Federalist Society being a sort of a legal, a conservative legal scholarship group that sort of put out these lists of judges they consider kind of proper conservatives in an attempt to sort of influence Republican governors and presidents into picking. And Trump has done this pretty consistently. Not just for his Supreme Court judges. He consistently picks Federalist Society type people. So this puts the court in a really quite dangerous place, because coming down the track we have one of the first cases after the election, a review of the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. There's also a good chance that coming down the track will be state abortion laws restricting abortion. And in a situation where Brett Kavanaugh is the swing justice, we are relying on someone pretty conservative to swing and side with the liberals.
Yep. And the US Supreme Court can have an enormous amount of power. There's something I heard about, which I can't remember the name of now, but it was an era of when they had a very right-wing court throughout the late 1900s and early 20th century. It only really ended with FDR, where, because in the Constitution you have a right to a mutual contract between private citizens that the government can't intervene in. They interpreted that to mean that huge areas of government regulations of workers' rights, of the right to a union, loads of basic workers' rights were just completely impossible for Congress or the President to do anything in huge areas of what we consider to be normal, politically contentious territory for how the economy should work.
Yeah, and as you say, this only really came to an end with FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, the Democratic president in the 1930s. New Deal, vaguely socially democratic economic reforms in order to try and ameliorate the worst effects of the Great Depression. And the Supreme Court was trying to strike... They were striking down everything or threatening to. And in the end, he decided to do something called court packing, which is a somewhat pejorative term, because the number of justices on the court isn't fixed in the Constitution. It's within the gift of Congress. Congress gets to decide how many justices are on the Supreme Court, and there haven't always been 9. In fact, I think initially there were only 7, and then at one point it got up to like 11 or something. There've been 9 for a while, over 100 years, but they haven't always. And Roosevelt decided he was going to try and pack the court and add extra justices to balance out or more than balance out the conservative justices on the court, such that they wouldn't be able to strike down his legislation anymore. He actually failed in so doing. Members of his own party, because at the time the Democrats had quite a substantial conservative Democratic caucus, mostly from the South, sort of refused to go along with this, but the threat of doing so made the Supreme Court sufficiently worried that they backed down.
It's a little bit like how the supremacy of the House of Commons in Parliament was established by the Parliament Act, which is obviously very difficult to do because the House of Lords would have to pass it as well. The idea that the House of Lords can't block legislation that's been passed by the Commons. That was achieved by threatening to pack the House of Lords with hundreds of new Liberal Lords. But they didn't actually have to do it because the threat was enough, again, in that case.
That was back in around the turn of the last century. Yeah. And yeah, so the confirmation of it, well, even in the run-up, brought up a lot of these debates again. A lot of the Democrats are thinking, should we pack the court?
Or indeed, should the role of the court be such as it is? Because a lot of countries have constitutions and Supreme Courts, but they don't all have the same power to intervene in politics and the decisions of elected in the state structure as the American. And also, it has this power to strike down legislation, not because it's in the Constitution. So that could be changed by an act of Congress.
It could. And so this is really the debate that's been going on within a lot of Democratic circles, is should we pack the Supreme Court? Should we add extra justices? Should we reform the Supreme Court, such as we, for example, bring in term limits for judges? Or should we, as you say, pass some kind of act of Congress which limits the scope of the court's authority so that it doesn't have this sort of huge amount of power that it has over the decades and centuries since it was originally implemented?
I think the main reason why it's unreasonable for it to have this much power is that it's not elected. If you're going to be in a democratic society, then the centres of power, particularly the centres of power, if you have the kind of power which allows you to set the political direction of state policy, that kind of power can't be in the hands of unelected parts of the state.
I think there's also a question of whether any single organ at the state should have as much power as the Supreme Court does, regardless of whether they're elected. I mean, the president's elected. The president of the United States is elected, but should the president, for example, have the authority to veto congressional legislation? I think there's actually a good argument to suggest that perhaps they shouldn't.
Yeah. Well, this is a strong argument that I've heard from some of the American left, that there is nothing which is quite the equivalent of a parliament in the American system. The closest thing is Congress, but it's missing a few things. But particularly the House of Representatives is the only directly elected part of the American system which functions on a properly democratic basis, really, because the presidency has the electoral college, and the Senate is wildly 20 million people have the same amount of 100,000 people, depending on what state they're from. So the legitimacy of the American system comes from a mandate from the people, and the only institution which has a proper full-blown mandate from the people is the House of Representatives. So that should be the seat of where political direction... that's an argument that I've heard. And that it therefore has the authority to limit the power of the other branches, including the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
If it doesn't have the power, then it certainly has the authority to.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I think part of the problem with packing the court would be that the problem is then as soon as the Republicans get power back in Congress, they'll just pack back. Right. And then you end up with this sort of reciprocal tug of war thing. That doesn't mean that it's necessarily a bad idea if you do it in concert with other things. I think on its own, it's certainly insufficient. Term limits, I think, in theory would be a good idea, but as I say, that would require a constitutional amendment, which in the States requires not only Congress and the president to agree, but also 2/3 of the state legislatures, which I just can't see happening for anything right now. Like they haven't managed to pass the amendment, whatever it is, 26th Amendment or whatever, the one that would give formal gender equality.
Yeah.
They still haven't managed to pass that, and that's been going for, 60 years? And that's still languishing in the sort of pending queue. So I just can't see them getting anything done by that route. Which might suggest that maybe having such a rigid constitution is maybe not a good idea.
That's the idea. I mean, many of the founding fathers would have agreed.
Oh, absolutely.
They weren't of the be treated with this level of kind of almost quasi-religious reverence. They thought that it should be changed quite a lot.
And they did. Yeah. They amended it quite frequently.
Yeah.
but there just weren't as many states then, so it wasn't as difficult.
Sure, I've seen this thing about Thomas Jefferson thought that essentially each new generation should basically rewrite the Constitution entirely themselves.
I have heard people argue similar things. More recently, there's a guy called Benjamin Studebaker, who I may have mentioned before, who he had this idea. I think he's somewhat abandoned it now. He had this idea called Sophiarchism, where it was some. Basically, he read Plato's Republic at too formative an age, and it slightly fucked with his head. A lot of his other stuff is much better, but there was an interesting core of the idea, which was part of this idea, was that you would have a new constitutional settlement written. I think he said I don't know. It doesn't particularly matter what particular timescale you put on it, as long as it's reasonably frequent. But I'm definitely
than every 300 years.
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely pro that idea. I think we desperately in need of a constitutional convention in this country, and
Absolutely,
I think that the United States probably ought to have a new one as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think personally, it's going to be a combination of things that the Democrats are going to need to do. I think definitely court packing as a short-term solution is not a bad one, but I think they also need to look at tackling the power of the court itself.
Yeah. I think we should take the perspective that the current status of the Supreme Court is a very problematic one. It shouldn't have that status, and so all tools available that can be used to try to fix that, whether it's packing or whether it's passing a constitutional an act that limits the power of the court, or anything anyone can come up with, should adopt the overall direction that this court is broken. It shouldn't be like this. We are taking up the democratic as where we'll take on. And I don't really know what the Democrats would do. Like, what's the alternative other than doing that? Just have every piece of legislation they try to pass struck down for the next however many years it is.
Yeah, I mean, Coney Barrett's very young.
Yeah,
she's a very junior judge. She's only an appeals court judge for 3 years. This is another thing. It's like, quite apart from the fact that this is really dangerous and the sort of hypocrisy of the Republicans, she's also very inexperienced. Which is, it's certainly not the biggest black mark against her. The biggest black mark against her, she's extremely conservative and has consistently voted to attack the rights of immigrants, poor people, etc., etc. But like the fact that she's so inexperienced is, I think, a point worth bringing up.
It demonstrates the fact that it's a political appointment.
Yeah.
And therefore the court is
definitely
already politicised. So recognising the fact that it is and taking it on that basis is legitimate. Because that's what the Republicans will say, is that if the Democrats try to do this, they'll say, oh, we're just trying to, obey the law. We're appointing judges when it obviously is.
Of course, yeah. I mean, they Coney Barrett calls herself a sort of strict textualist, right? So she follows the kind of original intentions of the framers behind the Constitution, which, quite apart from the fact that, anyone who's studied literary criticism for more than about 30 seconds will tell you that that's just impossible. That you can never get back to the original intentions of the framers, even with, the quite extensive writings they wrote, Federalist Papers and so forth. Every text has to be interpreted.
And if you're applying what you think their intentions were to the modern day, then you're inevitably thinking, what would they have thought about this? But then you're ventriloquizing them. You must be adding your own voice to it. So it's not originalist at that point.
Exactly, you're already in the realm of interpretation, so why not interpret them, things differently? It's so I was listening to there's a conversation on the Talking Politics podcast with an American legal historian and scholar the other week, which I should link. But she was essentially talking about this is sort of the overarching project of Mitch McConnell's sort of tenure at the top of Republican politics. To a significant extent, he doesn't particularly care about Donald Trump. In fact, he probably wouldn't care if Donald Trump lost the next general election, particularly. What he cares about is
long before Trump, and he'll be here long after.
Exactly. What he cares about is getting control of the judicial system, not just the Supreme Court, but all levels of the judicial system. And Donald Trump has appointed huge numbers of judges at lower levels. Three Supreme Court judges in one term is a lot. But if you look at his lower court appointments, he's got loads of them, and they're all really, really right wing. Yeah. He hasn't attempted any kind of balance here.
It's about fundamentally changing the practical meaning of the American constitutional system as it is actually expressed in really existing America, in order to marginalise because the American Constitution has always been a bit it's somewhat democratic, but also many elements of it are deliberately undemocratic. Founding fathers recognise that democracy would be bad for them and their class. So
Yeah.
it has always been contended to what extent are you emphasising the democratic elements of the American Constitution. Mitch McConnell's long-term project is to essentially change the practical meaning of the Constitution in a very undemocratic direction. Have the political elite have all the power, and have the American population have very little latitude for influencing the political direction.
And I mean, the reason for this is extremely obvious. It's that he knows full well
His ideology is extremely unpopular. It'd never win in a proper process.
way more Democrats than there are Republicans. Among independents, increasingly more independents are leaning Democratic. And all the demographic data that you care to look at shows that the core Republican base of older, white, lower middle class men, essentially, and not the women, women of the same sort of group don't vote Republican, but particularly men, is becoming a smaller and smaller percentage of the population. That isn't going to change, without some extremely draconian immigration restrictions, which we might get onto when we talk about the election.
But also, as the Republican Party shifts more and more towards having all of their political direction be serving the interests of the 1%, who have very different class interests to most older white men in America.
Yeah.
These people themselves are likely to, in the long term, start peeling away.
I mean, you've seen that with certain Republican politicians even who have left the party in the last few years and joined the Libertarian Party or whatever.
Yeah, right.
Because they appreciate that the Republican Party, as it currently exists and in the direction it's going, is no longer really the party of capital as such. I mean, in America, the relationship between the Republican Party and capital has always been a bit more fraught than between the British Conservatives and capital, because of the Democrats are sort of also a capitalist party, but the Republicans are no longer just standing up for the rich writ large. They are standing up for a very specific, narrow slice of the rich.
Yeah,
and
a very
powerful.
eccentric element to it as well.
Yeah.
In their interests are very odd. They require very unusual things to happen to them.
I mean, there's obviously the element of religious sectarianism as well. The Republican Party increasingly relies on evangelical Protestants above all. It has historically been the case that Jews, other non-Christian religious groups, non-religious people have voted Democrat,
And
but
Catholics,
increasingly,
in fact.
and Catholics to an extent. But increasingly, more and more Catholics are starting to vote Democrat, and more mainline Protestants are also switching to the
part
Democratic
of that is that Catholics are a very diverse group in America. Many German immigrants are Catholic. The average American Catholic is becoming much more Latin American as time goes by, and less German, Italian, Irish, whatever.
Yeah. Not necessarily less conservative, it must be said.
No.
And I think the Democrats down the line are going to have to deal with the conservatism of quite a lot of Latin American Catholic immigrants.
I agree.
Who are sort of a natural constituency for them in some ways, but not in others. But that's a side issue.
Mostly because the Republican Party clearly despises them.
Oh, of course, yeah.
And people notice when that happens and vote for the other people.
Yeah. I don't know, it's going to be an interesting...
The Democratic Party is an unbelievably broad coalition. Basically held up by mutual hatred of the Republicans. So, if in the long term the Republican Party starts to fall apart or lose the ability to win elections, that unifying enemy the Democrats won't have that, and will find it increasingly difficult to hold together as a... But that's quite a good get rid of the Republicans, and then the Democratic Party becomes the political spectrum. That would be a much better state of affairs than what America has at the moment.
I mean, we can only hope. My concern, of course, is that the Democrats, upon attaining power, when they next do, won't take the steps necessary to ensure that the Republicans are finished off in that way.
Not a chance in hell. They will not do that,
And I suppose that brings us more or less neatly on to what is in some ways the main topic of conversation.
Yeah.
Oh my god, we've been going for over 2.5 hours. We're only just getting to...
That was the starter. Get ready for a beef Wellington.
I'm making this up. It's the 2020 U.S. general election.
The one we've all been waiting for.
Yeah, I pass. Fuck you. But yeah. So there's this guy. He's a sort of New York huckstery kind of real estate mogul, son of a New York huckstery real estate mogul, and member of the KKK.
Yeah.
Grandson of a German immigrant. So he probably would rather you didn't know that.
Yeah.
And
he had quite a successful to remember.
Yeah, he got quite big. There was this guy who I read a profile of a while ago, who was big into reality TV, and he did a bunch of these shows, and he sort of really spearheaded the reality TV movement in the United States, right, by sort of copying Big Brother and things from over here. And he decided that what would really be good would be if he could get someone to front a version, the kind of reality that we had in Britain. And he settled on this other guy we've been talking about, from New York, this sort of huckstery real estate mogul with the orange skin and the bad hairdo and the extremely discriminatory policies towards renting his apartment. And yeah, he got pretty popular.
It's pretty popular, yeah.
I think a lot of people sort of loved to hate him more than loved him, really. But through the sort of late 2000s
it's like
and
2010s, as we have them.
Yeah, he sort of got bigger and bigger, and he'd always been sort of pretty in the public eye because he was always quite good at attracting attention. And they made a film in the 80s called Back to the Future 2 that was substantially at least taking the piss out of him. And he was in Home Alone too as well. Do you remember that? Yeah, he's in. And so this and then it comes to what is it, 2012, 2013, 14, I can't remember exactly. And Barack Obama is giving the White House Correspondents' Dinner address. And it's the sort of if you don't know, the kind of the setup here is that the President of the United States stands up in front of a room full of journalists and tries to tell jokes that someone else has written for him for half an hour. And that's a bit weird. And he decides to, at one point, he just decides to go really in on this guy, this New York real estate guy, because said New York real estate guy said some pretty unflattering and quite racist things about President Obama back when he was first running for office. When he ran for re-election, about, him not having... And so, Obama sort of takes a few pot shots, and the camera pans over the audience, and Donald Trump's just sat there. I've given the game away. He sat there...
so coy about saying it.
He sat there in the audience, and he's staring at Obama as he gives his speech, and his eyes are burning. You can see it in his face. If you haven't watched it, I absolutely recommend you do. You can see it in his face. This is the supervillain creation moment. I mean, he was already a prick, don't get me wrong, but this is the point where he really becomes genuinely top tier level evil. And he's like, I will get you, Obama. And so then he runs for fucking president, and for some reason, the American media decide to treat it as if, ha ha ha, look at this funny guy. Wouldn't it be funny if he won? And then it looks like he might, and they start to panic. But it's too bloody late. And then Donald J. Trump, Donald Judas Trump. His middle name's not Judas, but it's funny. It's a Red Dwarf reference. Donald J. Trump is actually not the 46th president of the United States, the 45th president of the United States, because one of them was president twice non-consecutively, and for some reason they number him twice.
Yep.
Which is really annoying. That was 4 years ago. You might remember.
Things haven't gone that well since, I feel, either for America or the world.
Yeah.
2016 was a bad year.
Oh, it was.
If you compare the state of the world then to the state of the world now...
Oh, if only we could do that. I brought up Back to the Future earlier, and it's at times like these you really wish for a flying DeLorean. So...
Anyway...
Yeah, Donald Trump's running for re-election, and for some reason best known to themselves, the Democratic Party decided that instead of Bernie Sanders or even Elizabeth Warren, someone actually halfway decent, they were gonna pick Joe Biden to run against him. So that happened, and so now we're in this situation.
The final run-up to polling day itself.
Yeah, as we speak, is It's about 3 days. It's 3 days to polling day, but as we're speaking, it'll probably be a day or two to polling day by the time you... Of course, polling day in the time of coronavirus is a bit meaningless, and we'll cover that in a moment, I'm sure. But, so, would you like to hear the 538 projections
Go on.
for the general election? Okay.
Love the
So
polling.
for those who don't know, 538 is a data journalism website that, among other things, does a lot of polling aggregation. And they are currently giving Joe Biden a 90% chance to win the general election, and Donald Trump a 10% chance. What do you reckon to that?
Well, for one thing, things with a 10% chance of happening do happen sometimes.
Do you know, David, they happen 10% of
They
the
happen
time.
1 in 10 of times. And there have been more than 10 elections ever.
I think you're right.
Yeah. So, for one thing, that's not really high enough for us to be complacent, for one thing.
Absolutely.
But also, 538 gave Hillary Clinton extremely high. It wasn't quite this high.
No.
So there is this hanging ghost over this whole election that Donald Trump is behind in much of the polling. But we've all seen this. The big difference is that Joe Biden's lead over Donald Trump, compared to Hillary Clinton's back in 2016, is much, much bigger.
Yeah, would you want to know the popular vote?
Yeah, go on then.
So the national popular vote on October the 31st, the average is... This is a weighted average, so they give more... slightly more credit to more reliable pollsters and more recent polls over slightly older ones. The average is... Joe Biden is projected to win 53.3% of the vote, and Donald Trump is projected to win 45.5%. So that's a lead of 7.8 points, if my maths haven't...
That's quite a big lead. I think it's basically inevitable at this point that the Democrats will win.
It seems quite likely.
But the thing is, they won the popular vote in 2000 as well. They won the popular vote in 2016 as well. But the American system appears to be set up such that it's the Democrats whether they win the election or not.
So would you like to hear the electoral vote numbers?
Yes.
Okay. If you didn't already work this out, David and I are both big, psephology nerds, which is the technical term for election data nerds.
Yeah.
Okay. Joe Biden is projected to win 348. Donald Trump is projected to win 100. And actually, if you look at the graph, the margin of error on that, they're actually pretty much non-overlapping. They only overlap extremely slightly. So basically, a normal-sized polling error that you might expect, which was enough for Hillary Clinton to lose in 2016.
Yeah.
Actually wouldn't give Trump the victory this time around. There would have to be a historically large polling error for Donald Trump to win. Or something has to dramatically change in the last few days. Sorry?
He would have to pull something unbelievable out of his hat.
Yeah, or the polls have to be drastically wrong. Somehow.
Yeah, right. Which it is possible that they are, because this is such an unusual election.
Yeah.
Right, so because of COVID-19, a lot of people are voting by post, and this is split down party lines in America. COVID and whether it should be taken seriously, whether changes in people's behaviour, whether people should change their behaviour in order to try and fight COVID-19, has become something of a partisan political issue. That seems insane to me, but it has. So this means that Democrats overwhelmingly are much, much more likely to be voting by post than Republicans.
But Republicans are still much more likely to be voting by post than in a normal year.
Yeah, that's very true. But this means that if there is something that causes there to be a difference, then it will not happen evenly across everyone. And one thing that almost certainly will happen is that postal votes will be counted slower.
Oh yes, that will definitely happen. For one thing, in many states, you can receive a postal vote several days after the election, and as long as it's been posted before the election day, or in some cases on the election day, depending on the state, it still counts. So there's going to be a big tail to this election. This is not going to be the kind of election where we are going to know all the results by, the end of election night. We may know the winner.
Yes, so that is
It's possible we'll know the winner.
Because there are particular states and particular districts where, for example, people aren't voting by post. It's not being allowed.
There's also states such as Arizona, which is a reasonably close state in this election, where they're very used to voting by mail.
Yeah,
they do it all the time.
So they'll
probably count those
results which come in pretty completely on election night.
Yeah.
Which way they have swung compared to previous elections, will give us something of a picture of probably, even if we don't have all the results yet. And if one side wins by an enormous margin, that will probably be clear quite early. So it's possible we will know the winner on election night. What is almost certainly likely is that, because of his character, Donald Trump will not accept that.
Yes.
Unless he wins. In which case he will accept it instantly.
And the worrying thing is that what is quite possible is that we get a lot of results in on election. Because votes in person are very likely to shift more towards the Republicans, because a lot of the Republicans have been told by Trump and other Republican leaders that postal votes aren't to be trusted, that a lot of the in-person vote will skew more Republican than the vote overall. It might look at some point on election night, that Donald Trump's in the lead, and if at that point Donald Trump claims victory, and then the postal votes start to trickle in, and then Joe Biden's back ahead, we then have a very sticky situation indeed.
He can then claim, having the election stolen from me.
Yeah. So let's have a quick look at because so the overall popular vote is pretty wide margin. Electoral votes in a pretty wide margin, But there are certain states that are more likely than others to be what's called the tipping point state. The state but has to be won in order for that side to win. And so
like just an extreme version of this to illustrate the point. If the Democrats have lost California, they have lost the election.
Yes.
And if you don't know anything about the other states, any election in which they're losing such a solidly blue state, they will have lost all the other states too.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's a less severe version of that if they've lost this state, then they've probably...
Yeah. So the most Republican state is the 3rd district of Nebraska. Actually, Nebraska, irritatingly,
Nebraska's weird.
Nebraska and is it
Maine
is the other one? Yeah, Nebraska and Maine split their electoral votes up by district in a weird way. So the most Republican constituency is Nebraska's 3rd district. The most Republican state is Wyoming. And the most Democratic constituency is the District of Columbia, Washington, the capital. And the most Democratic state is Vermont, Sanders country. In the middle, though, you have such states as Georgia, Maine 2nd District, Florida, North Carolina, New Mexico, Virginia, Colorado, statewide Maine vote, New Hampshire, Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Arizona, the Nebraska 2nd, Nevada, and the tipping point state, according to 538, Pennsylvania.
Mm-hmm.
It's all going to come down to Philly.
Oh,
Do you like a Philly cheesesteak?
Do you know, I don't think I know what one is. I know what Philly cheese is.
Yeah, a Philly cheesesteak is just meat covered in that between bread, basically.
It sounds nice.
Yeah. So, in Pennsylvania, the forecasted vote share is thus: Biden 52.2%, Trump 47.1%. So the gap is only 5.1. And so this is where it gets dicey, because in Pennsylvania, which is very likely to be the tip, a normal polling error of 3 points, say, could have Biden leading by only 2 points, which is about what Hillary Clinton. And with the Electoral College coming into play, it could get close.
And add to that the fact that Democratic votes will come in slower.
Yeah. So it's still unlikely. 538 says there's only a 10% chance of Trump actually winning legitimately. But if it's a close enough Biden win that those slow coming in postal votes in a few key states matter, we could be in for a very long few weeks. On the other side of
We're going to have terms which none of us knew before will become common political. In the hanging Chad became, everyone knows what they are now after 2000.
Oh, I love a hanging. Could have one for dinner every night. But the problem is that so people always go on polarization and partisanship in the United States, right? They talk about this a lot, and with justification. It has been on the increase lately. 60s or so. It's gotten sort of worse and worse with it. But they talk about it mostly in the context of partisanship makes it hard to get stuff done. Partisanship degrades the character of our politics, etc. In the era of Donald Trump, though, it's more partisanship is potentially lethal. There was a plot that was foiled by the FBI, I believe, a few weeks ago, to kidnap and potentially execute the governor of Michigan for bringing in certain COVID restrictions that were felt to be by these sort of right-wing libertarian / conservative / completely off their rocker militia people, a violation of their sort of liberty. Gretchen Whitmer, governor, was targeted, and after the plot was exposed, Donald Trump taunted her about it at a rally. You know, this is a hard-right, quasi-fascist terrorist plot to kidnap and possibly murder a sitting elected US governor, and the president is making jokes about it. You know, this is lock her up, but, you know, on steroids, right?
This is lock her up, but not have due process. Just kidnap someone.
Give me your take, David. I want your take.
On specifically the possible kidnapping of the governor of Michigan.
More generally, yeah, and more generally on the level to which you think that the kind of partisanship we're experiencing now is like different from the past and potentially more dangerous. I don't know to what extent
it's partisanship is exactly what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
I think you can certainly read it as the Republican Party sliding towards fascism. It has steadily over the last few decades been acquiring one by one all of the distinctive features of a fascist movement. And it doesn't have all of them. I'm not saying that they are a fascist party, but they have been moving significantly in that direction for a long time. They are acquiring a lot more, certainly since Trump, of the style of thinking which you need in order to end up as a fascist. And now they are particularly around this election, and this is what's particularly worrying about this election, is that if Trump tries to contest it and says that it's being stolen from him, this could accelerate quite quickly. The extra-parliamentary violence, which is required for it to be a proper fascist movement. That is accelerating very quickly, and operating in uneasy but effective coalition with that's a distinctive feature of fascism as well. That's happening a lot as well, particularly explicitly the extra-parliamentary violence, because at the protests of the police, particularly endorsing and handing out water to far-right protests.
Yeah,
you know, this is very, very serious, and it could get very, very quickly. So I suppose the way that partisanship plays in is the way that the rest of the Republican Party are going along with it.
A lot of what Trump has been saying and doing over his entire term and the campaign the first time around is sort of, in some meaningful sense, even if he himself is not a fascist as such, has been in a meaningful sense sort of doing a fascism, right? Contributing to the instantiation of fascist ideology and practice in the world, particularly within the Republican Party, within the broader American right. But when it comes to this election, I think this election is really a flashpoint. Yeah. And I think come what may, I think you're right. After this election, we are going to see real nasty problems.
I think quite a lot of people will probably step away from the brink. So, and there are a lot of people that are engaged and really invested in the Trump project, which, if it fails, go back to their normal lives. But I think what's quite likely is that a significant portion of it, probably the most extreme portion of it, will go the other way. Will go further down the road.
And so you have things like QAnon and stuff like that, which are sort of bubbling away in the background, and they're keeping people radicalized. And I really worry what people like that are going to do if Trump loses. On the other hand, I really worry what people like that are going to do if Trump wins.
Yeah, totally.
Because this is the thing, is that, like, if the 10% comes up and Trump wins the general election legitimately, without talking about him sort of stealing it, he then has a mandate of sorts, because he's almost certainly not going to win the popular vote, right, even if he does win the election. But he then has a mandate of sorts, and he will certainly interpret that as a mandate to forge on with a lot of the policies that he has wanted to but been unable to, or restrained from, or stymied from doing. So he's already talked about, if he wins, he's going to fire several people within his administration who are sort of right-wingers, but sort of in the sort of more conventional Republican mold, who have been sort of getting in his way. There was an interview with like an anonymous official in the administration who says that Donald Trump has explicitly said that in sort of
I must say that
in private.
Specifically on policy, the way he's governed has been pretty much just as a Republican. He hasn't really done very much that is that outside of the window of what most Republicans. The real difference is in the way that the bully pulpit of the presidency to construct the ideology and political direction of the right, as actually that in a fascist direction.
Yeah.
There are also real differences.
Yeah, no, agreed. But like, I think I worry to what extent if he were to win election, right? So we'll get onto the Senate and the House a little bit more in a bit. But like, if Donald Trump wins the presidency, the Republicans also probably keep the Senate, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's very little chance that Donald Trump could win. In fact, I think the 538 have it like calculated. They have other probabilities, but not that particular one. But like, if Donald Trump wins the presidency, the Republicans also probably keep the Senate.
Mm-hmm.
And so that means we sort of have the status quo, right, where the Senate are still in a position, the Republican Senate is still in a position where they can continue to sort of prevent the Democratic House from getting anything progressive through, and at the same time they can continue to confirm, whoever the hell Donald Trump wants to appoint to this, that, and the other position. And my concern is that, like, although he probably won't be able to get any legislation passed, because whatever happens, the Democrats are extremely unlikely to lose the House. So the House percentages are currently 98% for the Democrats to win, to keep the House. So there's an extremely low chance that the House flips to the Republicans. Though 2% is not nothing, but
in a presidential election, turnout will be higher, and if turnout's high enough, then the Democrats.
Yeah, but my concern is what Donald Trump does with his appointments procedures to various positions within the executive administration, such that the tendencies in his policy, which have been sort of sharply anti-immigration, sharply anti-environmentalist, sharply sort of anti-workers' rights, and I agree with you, not in a sort of like dramatically different way from a regular Republican, but I do think
just to make it clear that I'm not saying that it's not extraordinary that Trump's doing it. I'm just saying that the whole Republican Party is as bad as people think Trump is.
But I do think that if Trump wins this election, he is going to personally feel that kind of victory is going to give him the sort of impetus to sort of push that even further than he has been.
Yeah, I completely see that, yeah.
I can also see, he's been deploying sort of federal forces to sort of various cities, Portland most notably, but also Philadelphia and other places. I can see that ramping up significantly if he wins.
Also got to remember, there's an economic crisis happening under COVID.
Yeah.
And who gets to respond to that? Who sets the agenda for the first 4 years in America? A quite different economic model at whatever arises out of this crisis.
Yeah.
If that's Donald Trump, that's not going to be good.
No, it's really not. And so I think Donald Trump. It is worth noting that I think a second Donald Trump term might be even worse than the first.
Might be even worse than the first, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can totally see that.
Yeah. On the other hand, what if the Democrats win?
Right.
What if things go the way that it looks like they will and Joe Biden wins?
All of the things which led to... So, Donald Trump, part of the point of mentioning that there are many ways in which Trump isn't that different, is also to bring up the fact that the ways that he is different, a lot of that is the culmination of a trajectory that the Republicans have been on for a while. They have been moving in this direction, kind of since Nixon.
Yeah, well, before that even.
Oh, indeed. So, even if Trump loses, I see no reason to think that they won't continue further down this path. Trump wasn't the origin of why the Republican Party is lurching to the right. It's been lurching to the right repeatedly for decades.
Yeah.
Before either of us were born. And the American economy and society have many underlying divisions and problems, which are not going to be solved by Biden. And so all of the trends which led to Trump, both inside and outside the Republican Party, none of them are actually going to be fundamentally addressed, even if he loses. So the question is, even if he loses, where's the Republican Party going to be in 4 years' time?
People have said about a Tom Cotton presidential run, And Tom Cotton is like, what if Donald Trump, but competent?
Yeah.
Or more competent.
Yeah, really dangerous. Especially if what we talked about before, about how a hardcore element, current Trump base, disappears further down the rabbit hole, are properly organised. Because there are people who believe in QAnon in Congress now. Mm-hmm. They have extra-parliamentary, violent paramilitary groups that they already do, but that are much more aggressive and widespread than they were before. Plus, that kind of presidency.
Yeah.
Whoa, that's not looking...
So what do you think the Democrats have to do over the next 4 years to head that off?
Well, the number one thing would have been to nominate Bernie Sanders as nominee rather than Joe Biden.
Well, maybe Joe Biden dies and then Kamala Harris moves to Mars, and then Bernie
then Nancy
Sanders
Pelosi can become president.
No, then Nancy Pelosi gets lost in the Oregon forest.
Yeah.
And then who's behind Pelosi?
But she doesn't necessarily have to stay Speaker forever. You could end up with a progressive Speaker of the House.
How do they get rid of her?
But really, I don't think that would be enough to stop a decades-long slide towards fascism. Just one thing like that. There needs to be a really serious change of political direction from the centres of power of the American state. And so you say, what could the Democrats do to avoid it? There's lots of things that they could do. It's just none of them are very likely.
Well, we talked earlier about court packing and things like that.
Yeah. I suppose
Joe Biden's been surprisingly coy when asked about that in debates as to about whether he would do it. And if you sort of said a year ago, would Joe Biden pack the court? You'd say, God no, he's far too moderate for that. Now he's being rather coy about it and suggesting, all options are on the table and this kind of thing.
I must say, there does appear to be... what were you saying earlier, that the Republican Party isn't really the central party of American capital anymore? It's the Democrats, really.
Yeah.
That is a slightly different setup to what is the norm for countries which actually go fully down the road into fascism.
Yes.
So there does appear to be a very, very singular majority of interests of American capital and the capitalist class who are willing, politically active in an attempt to stop that kind of politics. Now, I don't think that necessarily means they're going to succeed, because it is their kind of politics which has led to this status quo, including extreme elements. But it does mean that there are quite a few very powerful forces in American politics. Not all of them ones that I really support, but they are there who don't like this tendency.
Yeah. And in addition to that, I do think that Biden's willingness to even consider these kinds of sort of constitutional reforms does show that, to a greater extent than I think has been the case in the past, really since sort of the transformative sort of kind of period of like Roosevelt, serious reformers, not revolutionaries, nothing of that nature, but serious reformers within the Democratic Party sort of coalition are starting to get some traction and are starting to have some persuasive influence, even over the elites.
Yeah.
I don't think that if you hadn't had the Sanders campaigns of 2016 and 2020, I don't think Joe Biden would be considering packing the court.
Yeah, I can see that. It does appear to be, it's a very antagonistic relationship between the elite and grassroots elements of the Democratic Party. But I must say that coming from a British perspective, it does appear to be they're a little bit more willing to work with each other than the different factions of the Labour Party.
Yeah, who are like arguably close
Joe
together.
Biden has treated the progressive elements of the party and Bernie Sanders since becoming them seriously different to the way that the right of the Labour Party and the current leadership have treated the left since they took over the party.
No, yeah, so, I think that's very true.
Yeah, I think if the position is going to be we try to form an anti-fascist popular front with liberal, the problem with trying to do that in the British context is centrists in Britain are not willing to hold up their end of that bargain.
Yeah.
And whilst in America it's still an extremely antagonistic relationship, I think that there is more latitude for working together against the really kind of apocalyptic, terrible stuff that's happening.
Yeah, no, I hadn't quite thought about it in that way, but I think you are right. That does ring somewhat true. So what else could the Democrats do other than packing the court? People have been talking about statehood for Washington, D.C., Puerto Rico, and I even heard, or rather read, sort of mentions of perhaps the Navajo Nation, which is the largest Native American reservation in the USA.
So I know that Puerto Rico and D.C. both have bigger populations than Wyoming, which is the US state with the lowest population. I wonder how the Navajo compare. Oh, no, even if it's lower, I think that's still a good idea.
But the Navajo Nation is, I think it's bigger than at least a couple. By area, it's bigger than quite a few, but by population, I don't know. It has population of 173,000. Okay, so it's maybe by population quite as big. What's the population? Population of Wyoming is just over 500,000. Okay, yeah. So by population, it's not in the same ballpark. But in terms of area, I mean, it's massive, right? It's bigger than West Virginia or Maryland. let alone Rhode Island or something like that. But yeah, I have heard that said. I mean, when it comes to DC, I think DC is a very clear-cut case. The population of DC want it. There's a very strong case for them having it, and I think it would be quite easy for the Democrats to get that through, assuming they win, the Senate.
It's kind of true of Puerto Rico as well.
Puerto Rico is a little more complicated because there are anti-statehood groups in Puerto Rico. I'm not sure what
it's more politically contentious, but it's still pretty overwhelmingly.
most
most Puerto Ricans do want it.
Yeah, let's have a look. Statehood movement. It's about 60 pre-referendum polling. Apparently, there's a referendum on the cards at the moment, which is due to take place. Was due to take place this. Oh no, there's a referendum due to take place on the 3rd of November. I didn't even know that. It's actually due to take place coincidentally with the election. Oh, that's good. That's cool. Right? Yeah. So the polling then is 70% for yes. In the most recent 40. There's some closer ones.
It's presumably non-binding though, because Puerto Rico doesn't have.
No, yes, absolutely will be non-binding.
But it will be a significant step forward. Anyone who wants to campaign for it in DC will be able to say, "Well, Puerto Ricans want it. They've just had this referendum. Are we going to deny their democratic rights as Americans?"
So 70% versus 30, 43%. I haven't had time to sort of sit down and do an average, but certainly statehood seems to be more popular than not. And more popular than independence as well, which isn't on the ballot, but some of the polling asked that as well. So yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, okay, so I think that's plausible, which would give the Democrats 4 extra senators, because DC would definitely give them 2, and Puerto Rico, I would imagine, probably they would get those as well, and a decent number of extra House votes. So that could definitely be a move they could make. I don't know what other reforms are sort of plausible. I think the Navajo Nation one, whilst an interesting idea, and certainly something that should be looked into, is probably a bit less likely, because it's significantly
I would
smaller.
support it, it's just, keeping it real, it's much less likely, yeah.
I would support it conditional on the Navajo actually wanting it.
Yeah, yeah, certainly.
Yeah. I could certainly understand them not wanting it, because that would sort of involve abandoning their claims to be sovereign, which are totally. Their claims to be sovereign in terms of American law aren't worth the paper they're written on, because Americans just ignore them.
Yeah,
but
I know that there are First Nations people in Canada who refuse to register and refuse to vote, whatever, because technically they never gave their land away.
No, absolutely.
As far as they're concerned, there is no Canada.
No, it was either stolen from them, or conquered in wars of aggression, and the treaties weren't properly honoured.
Mm-hmm.
There is a First Nation state in northern Canada, though. They do actually have their own state. I can't remember what it's called off the top of my head, but the northernmost state of Canada is actually sort of explicitly an Indigenous state with Indigenous governors. Obviously doesn't include all First Nations Canadian people, because it is a specifically defined geographical area, but they do have that, whereas America. Yeah, I don't know what else they could do. I think they do. I mean, I agree with what we said earlier about a constitutional convention being something they could maybe push for.
Yeah.
I think that would be very, very difficult and would take time to sort of get that into the public consciousness, but I think it's possibly something that they should start working on.
I suppose that's the thing to insist on, be opposing fascism potential, is to hold on to the fact that that's a very unpopular direction for America to take among the American people. So if the American Constitution functions democratically, it won't happen. So if we can reform America to make it into an actually democratic system, then the political direction will change as well. Like in Britain, when working class people got the vote for the two-party system, breaks up, the Labour Party exists, we have the NHS.
Yeah.
But the extent to which something is democratic isn't an abstract procedural point. It determines what section of the really existing material society gets to determine the direction of state policy. It is the central.
I agree. But then I'm a big constitutional nerd, so I wouldn't.
I think that could be a popular rallying cry, and speak something to the American story as well. The fact that we're fulfilling the promise of, the American promise, that honour that legacy, even when it's overcoming the ways in which the people that founded the country were self-contradictory, because they kept slaves and they wanted the Constitution to be undemocratic in many ways. We're honouring the best parts of our story. That could totally be a campaign.
You should advise the Democratic Party on long-term strategy.
Oh, they wouldn't listen.
President Ocasio-Cortez would listen.
Oh, I would go with that. Yes.
Ocasio-Cortez 2028. When she eligible at 28 or something, she can run that.
I think 24 actually. I think
Can she run 24?
It's really really close, but I think by like a matter of a month.
I do like Ocasio-Cortez. I like Omar as well. I think
absolutely.
if anything, I like Omar more. Yeah, you're right. October the 13th is her birthday, so yeah, she would be eligible in 24. Just.
Nina Turner was a really significant figure in Bernie's campaign. I can't remember what she is an elected representative of some kind, but in a state legislature somewhere. I think she's a state senator from somewhere.
Former.
Anyway, she's always
state
been really
senator.
good. I always liked her a lot. And I know that she's dropped some hints that maybe she's going to run.
Apparently, she was offered the role of vice presidential running mate.
Oh, right, cool. But yeah, we'll see. We've got 4 years to worry about that. Who's going to be the senator?
Oh, she's a history professor. Oh, I love her already.
She's what?
She's a history professor. I love her already. Yeah. Historians.
Unite.
Give all the power to historians. This is when someone points out that both Benito Mussolini and Pol Pot were history teachers.
Yep.
Yeah,
so be careful with scientists as well.
Yeah.
The only scientist is Thatcher.
Yes, she was a chemist.
Yep.
Yeah. Let that be a lesson to you.
Yeah.
I'm not sure
I
what,
shouldn't be
but...
Prime Minister, because I'll be Thatcher.
Now you're a physicist. That's different.
I suppose it is different, yeah.
Chemistry is much more sort of physical and like involved in the nitty gritty of things. I can see where that would lead you to a kind of petty bourgeois mentality that might inform a Thatcherite.
Yeah, I think she works in like food technology stuff. Was what she did before. Wasn't she really key in the invention of soft serve ice cream or something?
You know, that rings a bell. Yeah. Merkel's a chemist as well.
She is. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. It's something about women of that sort of generation who are chemists. I suppose Merkel's a bit younger.
Long-serving conservative heads of state in Europe.
Yeah. That's a fortunate cookie. Right. We should talk briefly about the Senate because we haven't really. 78% chance for the Democrats to take it. So
really?
that's
Wow.
good.
Okay.
Yeah, it's gone up a lot.
Well, I suppose if you win the Electoral College, there's always a chance you win the Senate because it's equally weighted across all the states.
Yeah, so like on September the 11th, which was its closest, according to the 5-day average since they started running it, they only had a 57% chance of winning it, and now it's up to 78. So it's gone up 20 points. That has actually swung quite a bit. I don't know if there's any particularly interesting. Tom Cotton is probably gonna fucking win. So 99%. He's a fascist, everyone. Do you think Bannon's gonna come back?
Bannon, did you say?
Yeah. I've got this weird feeling in the back of my brain that, like, because obviously him and Trump fell out, but when Trump's gone, right, assuming Trump loses, do you think Bannon will sneak back in and, like, start being an advisor to Tom Cotton or someone?
Oh, I hope not. He's very talented.
Yeah.
He's very good at winning. He gets what was popular about Trump, and it's a little bit palpable in his current camp. Got that element. I don't know how much of that can be put down to just Bannon, but I think probably some of it.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't he? There's some kind of legal proceedings against him. He committed fraud.
Yes. Yeah, he was picked up for. He'll get off that,
Yeah.
or he'll get like a tiny.
Yeah, he'll.
What other sort of interesting races we got? There's the Georgia race where it looks Republicans 57% chance to take it, but John Ossoff is Iowa. It's pretty close, 54% for the Democrats. The Georgia special election, that's an interesting one because that's going to go to a runoff probably because the Republican ticket is split because they have jungle elections where everyone can run in special elections, and it looks like that will go to a runoff because there's two Republicans who are trying to sort of out Trump one another. It's quite interesting. So you've got that, so that's probably going to go to a runoff. So that probably, and the runoff election's not until like January or something. So technically, the 2020 election won't finish until like January. It's going to be
Can't wait that long. We don't even know if the world will still exist then.
Yeah, I mean, if the Senate comes down to a single seat, that could genuinely make a difference, right?
Yeah, right. And the Senate's always pretty.
There's Maine, where Susan Collins is looking like she might lose her seat.
Ooh,
the Democrats have got 60% chance of taking her. North Carolina, 65%.
I know that there are a few. So back when what remained of Bernie's 2016 campaign started to try to get socialists and left-wing people elected as Democrats, there are some people who failed that first time round who have now tried again and won their primaries.
Yeah.
So it's already pretty likely that there will be quite a few more squad-type people
in the House,
entering the House this time. Cori Bush's mum. She was the first Justice Democrat.
Yeah.
Primary. But she has now.
Mm-hmm.
That's why AOC became the face of that part of the Democratic Party, is because she actually won her primary. I don't know who it was. She toppled someone really high profile in the Democratic Party as well. Like AOC.
Yeah, they were like the third highest person in the leadership or
Yeah.
something. Yeah. That was a big moment. I think we talked about that in our most recent episode. I genuinely think it was the most recent one we did.
Well, the one from last year.
Yeah, the year before.
Oh, right, okay.
The most recent one that's published. Yeah. God. It's been too long, but I'm glad we're back.
Yeah,
and
it's
hopefully
good to
we'll be back more sort of regularly. I've sort of pushed through the horrible mental breakdown of oh my god, my life is falling apart because I think I might be trans, and now I've just gone for it. So trans now.
Yeah.
Sorry, mum. Should we quickly recap then the Bolivia, New Zealand things?
Yeah,
Because
right.
obviously that was killed, and I think it's worth noting.
They are quite significant events, I suppose.
Yeah. So let's get those up so we can have the data for those, because I always... It's because he died, isn't it? It's in my head. Should we have a Sean Connery memorial episode? He was a bit of a misogynist praying, wasn't he? Let's not.
Yeah. I think it's really in the remit of the...
Yeah, that'll be the bit that if I leave that in, that'll be the thing everyone complains about. They'll be all your discussion about anti-Semitism with the Labour Party, we were on board with that, but how dare you about our beloved Sean? No, he was a real misogynist. I'm not saying I'm glad he's dead, but I'm not shedding any tears. Right, so
New Zealand first, or rather the Labour Party.
Why not? So. Again, this is stuff that was covered by us on the last episode.
But it was a little bit more fresh. But
yeah,
it's still
it's still fairly recent and it's worth going over. So, the 17th of October, there was a general House of Representatives of the joyous country of New Zealand. And, quite surprisingly, the Labour Party won a majority.
Which is exceptionally unusual because New Zealand has a proportional representation system.
Their proportional representation system, which specifically is mixed member proportional representation, was introduced in 1996, and since then no one's won a majority. So the Labour Party under Jacinda Ardern won 49 and 64 seats. The National Party, which is sort of their Tories, you can quibble this in a minute, but won 26.8% of the vote and only 35 seats, which is brutal, right? There's like a 20-point margin.
That is just astonishing.
Yeah,
I don't think there's ever been certainly in modern times, a British general election that's been that one-sided.
no, quite. The ACT, the sort of Libertarian Party. How do you have a Libertarian Party? Isn't that a contradiction in terms? Anyway, the Libertarian Party got 8% of the vote and 10 seats. The Green Party got 7.6% of the vote and 10 seats. The Maori Party got 1% of the vote and 1 seat. Although I think they only run in Maori electorates because New Zealand has special. And New Zealand First, the sort of UKIP type people, got 2.7% of the vote and no seats.
Bye-bye.
Yeah. So before the election, Jacinda Ardern's Labour Party were in government as the senior partners in a coalition with New Zealand First, which is a serious black mark against
Very serious,
her
yes.
sort of character. Yeah, let's not beat around the bush. But now they're in majority government. So, David knows much more about news. Take it away, David.
A little. I've only really learned very much since this election.
Mhm.
So, this election, the primary thing that is driving this huge swing toward is basically the fact that they have handled the COVID-19 extremely well. Compared to other countries, they've had... What have they had? They've had under 100 deaths. Significant, like 20.
New Zealand have had just under 2,000 cases and only 25 deaths.
Yeah, 25 deaths. Which is extraordinary. Brilliant. In a country of what, 5 million? Very, very good. So, but their actual manifesto was quite slim. There wasn't very much policy, certainly very much radical policy, in the Labour Party manifesto. So how they will actually govern is a bit of an open question for the next parliamentary term.
Mm-hmm.
Jacinda Ardern, personally, her politics are a little bit ambiguous. She has said in the past that capitalism is a blatant failure, but she's also not exactly a sort of populist left type figure. She's quite a standard issue politician who fundamentally changed society too much either. So I think she's neither a Blair nor a Corbyn type figure, and the particular policies that she's been elected on are pretty thin on the ground. So what she'll actually do, but either way, compared to what's been happening in a lot of other countries recently, this is the sort of thing that hasn't happened for a long time, which is a broadly centre-left party actually winning an election. Because there was a time back in the 90s and early 2000s where they were winning elections all over the place. You had Bill Clinton in America, you had Gerard Schroeder and Blair in Britain, you had these people all over the place. Whereas there's not really, apart from this New Zealand government, an example, a centrist or centre-left party, or certainly the traditional left party in a centrist mode, winning an election convincingly. There have been centrists winning elections like Macron, but not in the context of that particular formula of the traditional left party moving to the centre and then winning loads of elections hasn't really worked anywhere for a long time now. And that's not exactly what's happened in New Zealand here, but it is a non-radical left party. I don't know what that's going to mean for the future. Probably means something.
I think it's definitely interesting. I mean, one also wonders. So you said before that the manifesto that they stood on was quite sort of not particularly radical, but one does wonder how much of that was because they were expecting to end up in a coalition with somebody.
Right. Yeah. Totally.
And sort of what they'll do now they have a majority government is sort of up in the air.
That's true.
And so I could see them moving leftward.
The forces in New Zealand, which roughly align with our sort of political project, are partly in the New Zealand Green Party, partly in the Labour Party. New Zealand has elected by an enormous margin a leader who deliberately uses the bully pulpit of being the head of government to not stoke racism explicitly, to not endorse bigotry, and have some kind of vague language, but which is in support of a broadly progressive perspective on the world, which is not terribly usual in the countries of the democratic world at the moment.
Particularly in the Anglosphere.
Yes, particularly in the Anglosphere. So it isn't exactly a victory for our kind of politics, but it is still significant good news. Oh, it's worth noting also that the Green Party, which is in the New Zealand context one which aligns more with our kind of politics, also had quite a good night. They went up.
Yeah. And the Maori Party, although they lost a vote share, they actually won a seat.
Yeah, that's good. Ooh. Sorry.
Quite alright. Yeah. I don't have a great deal more to say about that, other than it's worth noting. Shall we turn to Bolivia then?
Ah, yes.
So this election took place the very next day, and this was much more exciting.
Yeah, and I give a much less qualified joy at this one.
Yeah. So, a few of you may remember that a little while ago, it was about a year ago now, right?
Yeah.
October, almost exactly a year ago. The leader of Bolivia, Evo Morales, stood in a general election. His party stood and won reasonably convincingly, but the election results were disputed by opposition and by certain international bodies. And there was what one could charitably call a right-wing military-backed coup.
Yeah.
And
a right-wing military-backed kerfuffle.
Kerfuffle, yes. And Evo Morales was kicked out.
Yes.
Of not just the office, but the country.
I don't have to point out that there is pretty much no evidence that he did that. And when it was disputed, he immediately offered to rehold the elections. So,
yeah.
Okay, you want to fight the election again? Let's go. But they didn't accept that. Instead, they launched a right-wing military-backed kerfuffle. Yeah.
And I think the fact that he didn't fiddle the election results is probably borne out by the fact that this time around, his party won by an even bigger margin.
Yeah, by an enormous margin.
Yeah, so the scores on the doors are the MAS-IPSP, which is the movement for socialism, political instrument for the sovereignty of the peoples, alternatively referred to as the movement towards socialism or the movement to socialism, won 55.1% of the vote.
Astonishing amount.
Yeah, just 55% of the vote. Can you imagine if the Labour Party won 55% of the vote? Can you imagine if the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn had won 55% of the vote?
That is, and also it's kind of that. It is that brand of politics.
Yeah,
that's what it would be like.
we'd be living in bloody. I
Cloud
don't know.
nine.
Yeah, I wouldn't be so bloody stressed all the time.
Yeah.
The FRI, the Revolutionary Left Front, won 28.83%, and I should say sorry. This is the presidential election. Here doesn't work quite the way. So the movement to socialism, their candidate was Luis Arca, or Luis Arca. I don't speak Spanish. He sort of personally won the 55.1%, and the candidate from the party known as the Revolutionary Left Front was Carlos Mesa. But he's actually part of the Civic Community Coalition, which is actually not revolutionary left by any stretch of the imagination. And then the candidate of the Crimoth, which is a right-wing sort of Christian democratic coalition, Luis Fernando Camacho Vaca, won only 14% of the vote. So I apologize for butchering all of those names in Spanish, and I apologize for slightly mistaking the nature of the nature of how the Bolivian election worked there. But yeah, essentially, the lefties got over half the vote, and the centrists and the right wing split the rest between them in a sort of 2-to-1 ratio of centrist to right. So basically, bloody good result all around.
Yeah, I think it's worth pointing out the real significance of Evo Morales when he first became leader is that Bolivia is one of the only states in the Americas which is majority indigenous, even to this day. But they had never before Morales had an indigenous leader. Bolivia is an extremely unequal society along quite rigidly racial lines. There is a white elite over a predominantly indigenous country who had previously not really had any political power before this movement.
It should be noted, by the way, that part of the reason why this has been the case is that a socialist government, which was in power in the sort of early 70s, was overthrown by, you guessed it, a CIA-backed military coup, leading to years of right-wing dictatorship, in which the former socialist prime minister, was murdered by a right-wing death squad, etc., etc. You know the drill. So yeah, this is not like an accidental fact.
Yeah, absolutely. When he was sworn in as president, he chose to do it at a significant indigenous site and said something along the lines of, well, he said it in speaking English, but it's something along the lines of, here
I think there's a sense in which you're always misquoting everyone by speaking English.
Yeah, indeed, because I'm saying it with my voice. Here ends 500 years of resistance, now begins 500 years of the fight back.
Yeah.
So
what a line.
The existence of the Morales presidency was an incredible victory in the first place. And it's so important. And the fact that he was kicked out by a military-backed coup was a disgrace. And their policy agenda was seriously radical and had a majorly positive effect on Bolivia. There's a massively successful anti-poverty program, getting people out of the slums, giving people jobs, building the organisations that are needed for continuing that work into the future. Trade unions, civic organisations, parties like MAS, which is an incredible organisation. It's vibrant, that kind of thing. And therefore bringing indigenous people into the political process in mass numbers for the first time, as has been borne out by these elections. They had formed the military, the Bolivian military, such that it had the school which you had to go through in your training. But basically the point of it was to teach people the history of colonialism in Bolivia and the history of the Spanish invasion, the genocide of the rest of the Americas, racially based class society that Bolivia had for for centuries before that. You had to go through that in order to be in the military. Extraordinarily good policy. I'm not going to be able to list everything that they did over that long period of time because there's loads of it and it's all great. but that just gives you a bit of a flavour of how
definitely
important MAS as a force in Evo Morales were. And the fact that, I mean, you always know it's going to be pretty good if the CIA try.
Can I get
But the fact
t-shirt?
that they've, yeah, right. And the fact that they have, after a year of extreme contention, failed to get rid of it. They've actually, MAS have gone up. They've won the election by an even greater margin. It's fantastic news.
It's good to end on an upbeat note, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, that's why I deliberately left this bit to the end, because I knew how horrifying some of the rest of it was going to be.
Yeah. Shows there are limits to the power of the Empire.
There are.
You can resist. Victory is possible if we stick together and if we fight for it. And if we organise.
And, of course, improvise, adapt, overcome.
Yeah. Improvise, adapt, overcome, revolt.
Yeah, right. We've been going for nearly 4 hours.
Yeah.
So I think, David, it's time we bring things
I think we bring things to a pleasant conclusion.
Do you have anything to end off?
I don't think so. Happy Halloween.
Okay. Happy Halloween.
For a few days ago, for people that are listening to this.
Yeah. Happy election for those who... yeah. We'll be back probably in a week or so when we might know the results, depending on how long they take to trickle in, and I'm sure we'll talk more about America then.
Mm-hmm.
David, it's been wonderful to speak to you again.
Likewise. It's great to be back.
It's so good to be back. And I managed to not destroy this episode by recording it with the wrong microphone.
Right.
So, yeah. Right, well, then it only remains for me to say thank you, comrades, for your time and attention. And viva la revolution.
That's that.
Apples! Apples are good. Have you returned?
There it is.
David?
Oh, hello.
David.
How are you?
I don't know what I appear to be back.
Pardon?
I'm just talking to myself.
Oh,
now.
okay. So we mentioned cheese earlier and it's been on my mind ever since. Okay, I'm over it now.
I've just eaten a maggot in this apple.
Ooh.
I thought that was just in films.
It's just one of those things that doesn't actually happen.
The rest is still good though, so
Yeah, good. Apparently there's a thing about slipping on a banana peel, the whole thing, but it doesn't really happen very much. It's a sort of odd trope.
hope everyone's having a lovely Halloween.
Yeah, indeed.
I mean, obviously, by the time you hear this, it won't be Halloween anymore, and anyway, there's a good chance I'll just cut all this out.
Hmm.
I might stick maybe at the end.
What about this sort of loose time? Can you hear me? I think there might be something wrong with the sound. I'm still recording, but I don't think you can hear me. How's that?
Fantastic.
Okay, right. For some reason, whilst I was away, Messenger had switched which mic it was using without me touching it.
That's fun.
But Audacity didn't, so it's fine.
So there's going to be a supple section of me doing what I think is my amusing time-wasting monologue while you're actually trying to talk to me.
Yeah, well, I was sort of doing the same thing. But then you started talking about something completely different, and I thought, hang on a minute, she's probably not heard me.
No. No, I was just amusing myself. And eating an apple.
Yes, I was eating some cheese.
Oh.
Because we mentioned cheese earlier, and it's been on my mind ever since.
Oh, that was delight tonight.